is the bonds existed, so how do you get your payment? Right? So you can really picture this as a coupon from the supermarket. Like you cut out a coupon from the piece of paper from the security, and then you take this to the bank, and the bank gives you the money in return. Right? So every year you cut out a coupon and exchange it against the cash at a bank. In Germany, these were pretty popular for different reasons. Germans' favorite hobby is tax evasion. So the point was that in the past we had to pay our standard income tax rate on capital income, which was 40-something% at that time, 45 I think. But there was no way how the capital income was reported to the tax authorities. So basically it was voluntary to put it in your tax returns. So how could you disguise that as in the best possible way is, well, you take the bonds in paper form, take them home, so it's never documented that you own them. And then once a year, you put on your sunglasses and fake mustache, you drive to a city 100 kilometers away, you take the bonds into the next bank that you find, and I actually have friends who work at banks, did apprenticeships there, who then had to cut out the coupons with them, and then they got the cash, and then they drove home and nothing was reported. Right? Nowadays, it's not possible because we have a capital gains tax, so if you still do this, you will remain anonymous. However, there's the 25% tax immediately deducted, so you make the fair tax payment. But probably there are still many people in Germany who have these bonds in paper form somewhere in their safes and banks somewhere stored. Right, so the coupon is just a kind of legacy word coming from the fact that these were actual pieces of paper where you had to cut them out. Right, so coupon is exclusively used for bonds, and generally we just say interest payments. In Germany, it's established that coupons are paid once a year, and in the US we have quarterly payments. You have a question?
Yes, I didn't really understand what's meant by maturity. So in this context.
Yeah, so there's basically just a fixed date when you have to make the payment. So if you think of this in terms of a timeline, so we would have a date called today, and then there is the maturity date. So that's a point in time. And at the maturity date, the company who borrowed the money from a bank, they have to pay it back to the bank. And then the difference between those 2 points in time, that's what we call the time to maturity. So in later notation, we're going to abbreviate today usually with a little t, and the maturity date with a capital T, and then the time to maturity would be the difference. That would be capital T minus little t. I think I have all formulas in this consistent setting, so the little t will always be the date when we're interested to compute the value of something, will always be little t. And then the maturity date, for example, of a bond or stock option or something else, or a derivative, that will be capital T. But we have this later in the slides. I have some kind of timelines so how it becomes clear. So usually there is kind of a fixed promised payment at the end of the product's lifetime, and then there's regular payments in between the interest payments. Right? And there at least needs to be a schedule when these payments have to be made and kind of how you determine. So what's the next thing? Influence on decisions. Well, there is no direct way because you don't have any voting rights directly in the General Assembly. However, there are some ways to indirectly influence the decisions. And most of all, you might put something into a contract that prohibits what the company is going to do. So for example, banks are doing this, and these legal clauses that they put into the contract, they're called covenants. So that's like a protective mechanism. So for example, a covenant could be, you are not allowed to borrow more money, or you have to ask me for permission. Right? So that could be a very strict covenant. So if the bank lends a large amount of money to a corporation, they can demand from the corporation, if you want to take on more debt, which is then obviously impacting the bank's position, right? Because if they have more debt, it's probably less likely that it's going to be repaid, right? So it's more risky. So the bank gets an approval right or something. Or there might be ratios defined. So you shouldn't take on more debt than 50% of your capital structure. Right? So you can put in part ratios. Or it could be a covenant saying, well, you have these valuable assets, you're not allowed to sell the assets without my permission or before you have paid back my debt. So you find them more in individual contracts with banks than in bonds, but there is sometimes also a standard set that you can find in bond contracts. So that's the first way to influence decisions, is basically by preventing that the company does something which might be damaging to you. And this will be something that, for example, quickly look here, come back to this balance sheet. This will be actually something that you're going to discuss a lot in next semester's class. So look at the two positions here on the right-hand side, right? So the balance sheet identity tells us that the value of the debt plus the value of the equity has to be equal to the value of the assets, right? It's the balance sheet identity. Now, put yourselves into the shoes of the equity holders, right? So you are controlling the company usually, you are kind of naming the managers. How can you increase your value? Well, the first thing is you can create value through economic activity. You can increase the value of the assets. But your equity value is the value of the assets after the value of debt, right? So what else could you do? You could do something that's harmful to debt holders, right? And steal from them, right? That's called debt holder expropriation, right? So there are some things that you can do which decreases the value of the debt, right? And the covenants that I've just talked about are basically in place to prevent that. And this is really what you're going to study next semester with Ursula Walter. She'll talk about these principal agent problems. The interests of debt holders and equity holders might go into different directions. There are lots of problems which are caused actually from having debts, and you might actually engage in non-optimal investment decisions and so on if you have too much debt. There's a second way to influence decisions, and maybe let me jump to this, and this is in the case that there is bankruptcy and the trustee or the company says that they want to reorganize the company and restructure it, then the debt holders have to approve that. If it's just a single bank, which is the debt holder, then you could directly go to the bank and negotiate with them as a manager of the company. So that might be really easy. But if you issued a bond, it's actually quite problematic to identify who are actually the holders of the bond because there's no registry for it. Right? So I think I mentioned this here for the stocks, but for stocks usually there is a way to register who owns the stocks. Right? And then if they want to send out a letter or an invitation to the General Assembly, they have a list of names where they can basically send them the letters to. For bonds, this usually doesn't exist. So if you want to have all the debt holders in the room to vote on the plan, it might be very problematic if you have really dispersed ownership. There are many bond holders. So these are the two ways how you can influence decisions. You can vote in case of bankruptcy, and you can prevent things which might not be good for you. So there is very obviously no liability for debt holders. So as a debt holder, you're never forced to put in additional money. You might want to do that voluntarily. For example, if you're a bank, you might think of maybe giving another loan to the company to just keep it alive. But that's voluntary, so you don't have to. And then the final thing that we need to discuss is seniority. And generally speaking, the debt holders stand in line before equity holders, so they're more senior. But then within the group of debt holders, there might be some differences. So generally speaking, there are two types of seniority. There's the senior debt, so that's preferred, and there's subordinated debt. So typically bank debt is senior debt, and bonds are rather subordinated debt. Right? So again, within the group of debt holders, there are differences. And finally, there might be so-called collateral. So, for example, suppose a company has a very valuable machine. You can link the machine to a certain debt contract, right? So you can say that for the bank, right? So the bank has the right to get the machine and sell the machine and pay back its debt from that sale. Right? So collateral in German would say Sicherheit, right? So it's just a safety deposit. And there are certain financial contracts which are linked to collateral, so they're more